Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a really powerful idea from the psychologist Carl Jung, one that might make you look at your own life in a completely different way. He called it the family constellation. And it's this idea of a hidden blueprint passed down through generations that shapes our biggest life decisions, often without us even knowing it's happening.
So let's just jump right in with a question that I think hits close to home for a lot of us. Have you ever been in a situation, maybe a relationship or even an argument, and thought, wow, this feels eerily familiar, like you're living out a scene from your parents' life? Well, Jung was absolutely fascinated by this invisible pull that seems to make us repeat family history.
And, this wasn't just a casual observation for him. He saw it again and again in his patients. Like this quote here. He noticed how a daughter might not just adopt her mother's worldview, but would unconsciously use the exact same phrases. It was like an echo from the past. But Jung was a scientist, right? So he wasn't satisfied with just noticing it. He wanted to measure it.
So how in the world do you measure something so invisible? Well, to get a map of these hidden family ties, Jung and his team turned to a really clever tool. It was called the word association experiment. The whole idea was to find a way to peek behind the curtain to see the unconscious machinery that's running in the background.
The setup is actually pretty simple. I'd say a word to you, maybe something like tree, and you would just say the very first thing that pops into your head. No overthinking it, no filtering. The real goal here was to see if the way people connect ideas, their reaction types, followed some kind of hidden pattern, especially inside of families. And to put this to the test, one of Jung's pupils, a Dr. Emma First, launched this massive study. Just look at that number. She collected over 22,000 individual word associations from 24 different families. This wasn't just storytelling anymore. They were trying to build a real, data-driven case for this idea of psychological inheritance. And the results that came back from all that data, honestly, they were a huge deal. They painted a really clear, statistically significant picture of what you could call a family echo effect.
Okay, now what's so fascinating about this chart is how you read it. It actually shows the difference in how people reacted. So a lower bar means their thinking was more similar. And the data was just undeniable. Unrelated people had a difference of about 6%, but family members, they were down around 4%. This was it. This was the hard evidence that, on an unconscious level, families really do think alike.
And it gets even more specific when they started breaking it down by parent. The study actually found that the mother's thought patterns were a stronger influence. You can see it right here. The difference between kids and their mothers was just 3.5%. With their fathers, it was a bit higher at 4.2%. It suggests that the psychological bond with the mother was just measurably tighter.
So, this begs a huge question, right? How is this influence even transmitted? Is it just from listening to your parents talk all the time? Well, Jung argued it was something much, much deeper than that. He believed it wasn't about the words that were spoken, but about the feelings that were left unsaid. Jung's big insight was that children are incredibly sensitive to the emotional air in their home. The hidden tension between parents, the secret worries, the dreams that never came true. All of that creates an emotional atmosphere that a child just soaks up like a sponge. And that atmosphere ends up shaping their entire way of being.
Let me give you a case study that just makes this so clear. Jung talks about a mother, 45 years old, who was just miserable in her marriage. In the experiment, her reactions were full of this intense disappointment, which, it made sense given her life. But here's the shocking part. Her 16-year-old daughter, who had her whole life in front of her, showed the exact same pattern of disappointed emotions. Jung's conclusion here was pretty stark. The daughter wasn't really reacting to her own 16-year-old life. She was just unconsciously imitating her mother's emotional posture. And think about how dangerous that is for a young person trying to find their own way. She was starting her journey already carrying the emotional weight of a life she hadn't even lived yet.
And look, these inherited patterns, they don't just stay inside our heads as feelings. Jung saw over and over again how they actively steer our lives, how they can shape our destiny in these profound and sometimes really tragic ways. For example, he treated this highly intelligent 26-year-old woman who came to him with a very strange problem. She was completely convinced that the way she looked at men made them have indecent thoughts. Now, on the surface, that sounds a bit like paranoia, right? But the real cause was something else entirely, a powerful, unconscious pattern she'd inherited. When they started to unpack her life story, this devastating pattern just snapped into focus.
As a kid, the main men in her life were her eccentric father and her beloved older brother, who tragically developed a severe mental illness. This became her template for love. So without ever realizing it, she was drawn to unstable partners, choosing one man who turned out to be psychotic and another who'd been in a mental hospital. It was a heartbreaking cycle.
Or here's another classic example Jung gives. A woman whose marriage was just completely falling apart. Her husband was a decent guy, but in her mind, he just could never, ever measure up to the perfect, idealized image she had of her father. That unconscious loyalty to her dad made it impossible for her to have a real, healthy relationship with her husband.
So for Jung, these weren't just sad, isolated stories. He saw this dynamic playing out everywhere. This family constellation, this whole web of unconscious loyalties and inherited feelings, it could dictate who you fall in love with, what career you choose, all while you think you're the one making the decisions.
Okay, so where does all this leave us? I mean, are we just puppets, doomed to repeat the past? Well, according to Jung, the answer is a really hopeful, definitive no. He believed there is absolutely a way to break the spell. The very first step is a really important shift in how you think about all this. The point of digging up these patterns is not to play the blame game. Your parents were probably caught up in their own inherited patterns. The real goal is just to understand, to finally see the invisible script that you've been handed.
And really, awareness is the magic key here. The path to freedom boils down to these 3 steps. First, you've got to recognize the pattern. Notice the themes that keep showing up in your life. Second, you try to understand its origin. Trace it back to that emotional atmosphere of your family. And then third, and this is the most important part, you use that awareness to make a conscious choice, to react differently, to write a new ending to the story.
In the end, Jung's work doesn't really give us easy answers. What it does is give us a powerful new question to ask ourselves. By understanding this idea of the family constellation, we get the chance to finally separate our own voice from the echoes of the past, and that gives us the freedom to truly choose our own path. So the question to leave you with is, what invisible pattern might be waiting for you to discover?